Hey guys, I thought that this week would be a really good time to go over reproductive hormones, especially putting them more in context. I feel like hormones are a really difficult thing to look at just individually, and when you really understand the cycles that they work in, it's a lot easier to remember what each individual one does. So first, let's look at which hormones are critical to the reproductive cycle, and this is especially going to look at the mare since she's a little more complex. First is gonadotropic releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, estrogen, progesterone, prostaglandin, prolactin, oxytocin. And if you understood these 8 hormones, you would have a really good grasp on how the reproductive cycle actually works. So first, gonadotropic releasing hormone. It, like other releasing hormones, starts off from the hypothalamus, so inside of the brain. And it has a really short distance to travel. It just goes from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. There, it's given the name, it's a releasing hormone. And so you can think of like gonad, like reproductive organ, and releasing hormone, meaning that it's going to trigger more hormones to be released. So it's going to trigger the release of LH and FSH, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. It has a pretty standard job, not the most complex one that we'll look at. So yeah, it's going to go from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland, which lies right down below it. This is, if you think about it as, this is kind of the front of the horse's head with the muzzle down here. And then like the jawbone would be down here, and this is where the brain is lying. So the first hormone that's going to trigger is follicle stimulating hormone. So it comes from the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary. That's the part that produces hormones, as opposed to the posterior pituitary, which has another job that we won't get into. So it is going to go from the anterior pituitary down to the ovary. There it's involved in early follicle growth. So I think about it as follicle stimulating hormone. It starts with an F. It's first before luteinizing hormone. So it comes first. So it's going to work through follicle growing kind of in these earlier stages especially. And it's also sometimes, this is more of a horseball question, but there are 3 stages of follicular growth: primordial, growing, and Graafian. So Graafian is kind of like before the follicle is about to be released. So follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates follicles to grow. This is also a good time to think about what exactly our anatomy is. So the follicle stimulating hormone is coming down to the ovary, which is attached to the fallopian tube, the uterus, which is connected to the vagina by the cervix, which is kind of just, the cervix is basically just like a really tight muscular circular structure. So it's also very interesting to contrast mares with humans or other animals. It's very odd. The mare's ovary is basically inverted. So if you think of a regular ovary as like a pizza where the stuff is on the outside, the mare's ovary is kind of like a calzone where all the stuff is on the inside. So if you were to, say, cut open a human and see their ovary, and if they had any growing follicles, like you see in this picture, you would see them on the outside. However, with a mare, the follicles are actually growing on the inside of the ovary, which is very odd. And then they ovulate from a very particular spot, the ovulation fossa. So whereas a human could ovulate from anywhere along this ovary, the mare is going to ovulate from a very particular spot, the ovulation fossa. Next is luteinizing hormone, and it's just like follicle stimulating hormone, it's also produced in the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropic releasing hormone, and it has the same destination of the ovary. Its job is kind of the later stages of follicular growth as well as ovulation. So you're going to see a surge of luteinizing hormone right before ovulation that actually triggers the oocyte or the egg to be ovulated. It's also, if you think of luteinizing, it's going to cause luteinization, if you will. So it's going to cause the site that the egg was released from to turn into almost this, like a scar, you can think of it as. So it's going to cause the development of the corpus luteum. And again, luteinizing hormone you can think of last, so follicle stimulating hormone first, luteinizing hormone last, and it's going to cause the corpus luteum to form. And the corpus luteum has a job as well. Here you have, this is not a mare's ovary, and you know that because you see all of the different follicles as well as the corpus lutea on the outside. If this were a mare, you probably wouldn't because their ovaries inside out, essentially. So here you can see kind of a graph. Follicle stimulating hormone is kind of more constant, whereas luteinizing hormone really peaks, triggering ovulation. Another one, probably the one that you always hear about, is estrogen. Estrogen is produced in a few different places in mares, from the growing follicle, as well as the placenta and the embryo. So the growing follicle, that kind of makes sense because if the mare is growing a follicle that's going to eventually ovulate, estrogen is going to cause that mating behavior. So if she has a follicle that's really developed, it's going to be producing a lot of estrogen, and her brain's going to be thinking, okay, I probably need to get pregnant, so I need to be interested in stallions that I see. So it's going to trigger that mating behavior in the mare, as well as helping to trigger the luteinizing hormone surge just prior to ovulation. And it definitely has a bunch more complex jobs than this. This is kind of a simplified version of that. Next is progesterone. Progesterone is basically what tells the body you're pregnant. So it's produced by the corpus luteum. So thinking about this in stages, we've ovulated, we have the corpus luteum. We need to tell the body not to get rid of a pregnancy if it's there. We need to tell the body basically like put everything on hold for a few days. Let's see if we get pregnant. So progesterone is going to come from the corpus luteum to the brain, and it's going to say, hey, you're pregnant. It'll also come from the placenta eventually. So once the mare actually does become pregnant, it's going to come from the placenta, go to the brain, say, you're pregnant, don't produce any GnRH. So that suppression of GnRH, what's that going to do? What does GnRH normally do? Normally, GnRH is going to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So if we take away the gonadotropic releasing hormone by producing progesterone, we're not going to be developing follicles. We're not going to be ovulating follicles. So this is really important because it's basically putting everything on hold to see if the mare gets pregnant. Then at about 12 to 14 days, if she isn't pregnant, the body's going to realize that, and it's going to destroy the corpus luteum, and therefore progesterone will stop being produced and will kind of restart the cycle over again. So when progesterone is not produced, gonadotropic release hormone is going to be produced, allowing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone to be produced. So what's responsible for destroying the corpus luteum is prostaglandin. So prostaglandin is produced by the uterus. Once the uterus realizes, hey, we didn't get pregnant, there's no reason to stop the reproductive cycle. There's no reason to stop ovulating. So it's going to destroy the corpus luteum. When you destroy the corpus luteum, you're going to stop progesterone from being produced. And when you stop progesterone from being produced, you're going to allow gonadotropic releasing hormone to be produced. So here's a chart that I've made that kind of runs through it all, but it's an easy way if you already know what's going on to remember it. So we can start with pre-ovulation. Start with, where's GnRH? It's not here. Sorry, this is for a class that I had and we didn't discuss gonadotropic releasing hormone. So basically, let's start here. So the pituitary produces luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to trigger early follicular growth. Luteinizing hormone is going to do late follicular growth. This is going to go into pre-ovulation. So this follicle is going to get big. It's going to produce estrogen. This estrogen is going to drive down progesterone. Because there's not a lot of progesterone present, we're going to have a lot of GnRH. That GnRH is going to trigger luteinizing hormone from the pituitary, and that's going to trigger ovulation. After ovulation, luteinizing hormone is going to trigger corpus luteum production. That corpus luteum is going to produce progesterone. Estrogen is not going to be present in large amounts because the follicle, which was a major source of it, isn't there. And the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone is going to be decreased due to the progesterone. So now we have two options. If she gets fertilized, then prostaglandin is going to be produced from the uterus, and it's going to destroy the corpus luteum, which is going to decrease progesterone, which is going to allow luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone to be produced and restart the cycle. And I'll also email this out so that you can look this over and kind of go through it yourself, because that's probably what helps the most in remembering it. So the other place that we kind of have a hormone cycle is with milk production. So there are two main hormones here, prolactin and oxytocin. Prolactin is responsible for actually producing the milk. So pro meaning for, and lactin, obviously like lactose, milk. So it's from the anterior pituitary, just like luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone, and it's going to go to the udder of the mare, and it's going to result in producing milk. And its trigger is actually suckling from the foal. Oxytocin is responsible for actually releasing the milk. So it's from the posterior pituitary, and it goes to the uterus and the udder, and it's responsible for smooth muscle contraction. So when the mare is pregnant and she's about to give birth, she's going to start producing a lot of oxytocin. It's going to cause her uterus to contract with really strong contractions to get the baby out. And at the same time, it's going to be causing contractions within the mare's udder to result in milk letdown so that the baby's actually able to nurse. It's also responsible for bonding, calling it the love molecule, I guess, if you want to. I kind of think of it as like a happy hormone. It makes them really interested in their baby. Sometimes, particularly with small animals, they might give oxytocin to trigger stronger contractions within them if they're birth whelping, whatever the birth process is for cats, queening, I think. So that might trigger more smooth muscle contractions. Here is kind of a wider look at what all is going on during the process, tracking follicle stimulating hormone and when it's going to peak, as well as luteinizing hormone peaking, and kind of going through the different stages from primordial growing, Graafian follicle, then ovulation and development of the corpus luteum. And that's kind of all of the slides that I have on it. This is something that once you wrap your brain around it, it's really simple, and you probably won't really forget it that much, but really initially trying to put all the pieces together can be kind of difficult. So I am definitely going to send this out and try and take a look at it and really go through the stages on your own, understanding what triggers every individual thing to happen. So yeah, and as always, email me or anything with any questions you have.